Good afternoon, everybody. I'm just going to wait for people to join us and then we'll start in a moment. So we're just going to wait another moment while people, because I can see that there's still a lot of people coming in. Okay, so I think we're ready to go. So I really want to welcome everyone to this webinar on women in politics and online abuse. I'm Orla O'Connor and I'm the Director of the National Women's Council. And this is a joint event with the European Parliament on women in politics and online abuse. And we're really delighted in the Women's Council to be able to partner again with the European Parliament office in Ireland. And I really want to thank them for continuing to work with the National Women's Council to highlight really critical issues that are impacting on women and women's equality. And, you know, the issues around online abuse have been consistently raised by the members of the National Women's Council. We know that social media is a platform to express ourselves by debating, networking, sharing information, and also using it as a vital campaigning tool. But women are telling us more and more about the rise in online abuse and how it affects their freedom of expression. We know that women in politics are very likely to experience serious and often unrelenting online abuse, just for the fact that they are women who have come forward. And then for women from minority backgrounds, sexist abuse is often compounded by issues such as racism and homophobia. So we know that women get abuse for expressing feminist views, for challenging the patriarchy, and for those who are non-binary, they face harassment online for not conforming to gender norms. And this harassment has a significant impact on women in public life, and also, and it's really important to say, on their staff who are monitoring the accounts and who are exposed to this abuse on a day-to-day basis. But it also, and I think that's why this webinar is so important, it has much wider implications for our democracy. When many women, and we know this from speaking with women, are reluctant to come forward for standing in politics for fear of the abuse and online harassment. So that's one of the reasons why today the National Women's Council is really calling on social media companies to tackle online abuse, to take it far more seriously and to be proactive in tackling it so that women, including women in politics, are safe on their platforms. Women have the right to be free from discrimination and abuse online. So I'm really delighted today to be joined by such an expert panel of speakers. So you're going to be hearing from Tom Felle, Gina Miller, Maria Walsh, Colm O'Gorman, and Hazel Chu. And I'm going to introduce them in more detail as they're going to come and speak to you. For engaging in the conversation for the webinar, use the hashtag #StopOnlineAbuse on Twitter. We're also live streaming on the National Women's Council Facebook page, so you can submit questions through that and also through the Q&A here on Zoom. And then there'll be a time after the speakers for me to, to give the questions that you've put in so that we can have a good and fruitful discussion. So now I'm going to go straight and introduce you to the first speaker, who's Tom Felle. And Tom Felle is Head of Journalism and Communication at NUIG Galway. He's a former journalist and a foreign correspondent. He started his career with the Connacht Tribune, worked for the Irish Independent and the Irish Echo in Sydney. And he has done extensive research on this area, and we're going to be hearing about that research now. So over to you, Tom. Thank you.
Sorry, everybody, forgot the mute button. Thanks, Orla, and good afternoon. And thank you very much to the European Parliament for the invitation and to the National Women's Council of Ireland for the invitation to speak to you all today. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about some research that's ongoing at NUIG Galway into this issue of social media and misogyny. and online abuse, particularly a study that we're in the middle of, talking with local and national politicians in Ireland on this issue. So I suppose foul language and campaigns against public representatives is nothing new, but in the social media era, this has gone to a whole new level. Threats of physical violence, orchestrated campaigns of abusive messages, even threats of sexual violence and death threats are now, unfortunately, it seems, par for the course in political discourse on social media, and female politicians are a particular target. This all comes at a time when political parties are at least they're being encouraged to get more women to enter politics. But we're a long way off 50-50 gender splits, either in Parliament or in Cabinet. It's important for democracy that both genders are represented equally. We know that, for example, companies with a gender balance on their boards are more profitable. Why? Simply because they make better decisions. The same is true of politics. A gender balanced cabinet will make better decisions, and this will lead to better outcomes for all of us. Unfortunately, though, when it comes to the digital era, a number of factors are pointing to the fact that things are actually getting worse, particularly when it comes to how female politicians are treated online and in social media discourse. I don't have to speak too long about the issue of Brexit, but if any of you were following the Brexit issue, as I was, because I lived in the UK for about 6 years, up until 2018, you couldn't help but note that one of the things that Brexit did was it legitimized a particular nasty, pernicious, and destructive form of online engagement. And the same is probably true, actually, in the US post-2016. An interesting statistic is that of the 70 MPs who stood down, in last year's House of Commons election, there were many reasons why they did, but some of the interesting outcomes of research in the UK, for example, an interview with a former MP, Heidi Allen, first elected only in 2015, said that the impact of social media was one of the main reasons she decided to leave, and she wasn't alone. She said that she had received utterly dehumanizing abuse on social media, aimed at her staff, and her family. Dame Caroline Spellman said that the intensity of abuse arising out of Brexit was one of the reasons she left. Nicky Morgan, the former cabinet secretary, said that there was a clear impact on her family of online and social media abuse. Diane Abbott, the first female Black MP elected to the House of Commons, has lived with racial and misogynic abuse for more than 20 years. So what about Ireland? Well, our study, which has been ongoing for about 6 months, we set out to look at whether this issue is prevalent in Ireland, and we were fairly sure that it was. I'm just going to share my screen with you all now, and just to talk through some of the I suppose the parameters. It was a qualitative, semi-structured study, and we spoke to 69 people so far. It's ongoing, and from all the major political parties, some TDs, some senators, and some former TDs and some former senators, and a number of local councillors right around the country. It's important to say that it's a qualitative study, so while we can't draw general conclusions that are representative, it is clear that there's a pattern and there's a significant problem with online abuse. And the findings are shocking, I'll be honest, they're absolutely shocking. 96% of female politicians said that they had received social media or electronic messages that were included, for example, foul language or hate mail, or made inappropriate comments about their appearance and their intelligence. 73% were threatened with physical violence via social media. 38% were threatened with rape or sexual violence, and 28% said they had been verbally abused in public. One respondent said that she had feces thrown at her in a public park. Another said that she had been threatened online by a troll to have acid thrown in her face. 3 said that they had their children, their partner, or another family member had been subjected to verbal abuse as a result of positions they took on particular political issues. 14 had received threatening and abusive phone calls at home or on their mobile phones. Melanie said this happened at weekends and at nights. 1 in 5 said they were worried about their family's safety as a result of threats on social media. And 1 in 10 said they didn't feel comfortable attending large public meetings alone. About 20% said that they had considered quitting politics. But that figure is much higher among local politicians, where the stresses seem to be quite significantly higher. And female politicians said that they often felt worried or stressed and harassed, and have expressed concerns about their own mental health as a result of social media and online abuse. 9%, which is quite a low figure, said that they had considered reporting online abuse to the police or to social media companies. And there were a number of reasons why that figure is so low, but there was a lot of concern about being portrayed as a victim and about public reaction to going public with something like this, and about how they might engage with their constituents, because a lot of online interaction is now with constituents on social media. It's how public discourse happens. 3 respondents of the 69 we spoke to said that they had reported social media abuse to either the police or social media companies. But of those, they said that they found it hard to get Gardaí or social media companies to take the threat seriously, which again is quite worrying, that there was a perception that politicians were fair game. A quote from one former TD there, I was repeatedly threatened by a troll who threatened to throw acid in my face. Another one said he knew where I lived and he'd be standing in my front garden waiting for me, which again is quite a menacing and threatening thing to send to anybody. A bit of international perspective here. So Ireland is not alone. This is happening in many countries, and there's research showing that it's increasing in the US, in the UK, France, Australia, and other places. MEPs, and I know Maria Walsh is joining us today, have reported near daily online and social media abuse, according to the European Ombudsman, Emily O'Reilly. 100% of female MPs in the House of Commons in the 3-week period leading up to the 2017 general election received 25,688 abusive tweets. So that's just to give you a sense of the scale of this. Intersectional abuse, which might be misogyny combined with homophobia or racism, is in far greater evidence internationally. And there's some anecdotal evidence, or claims, I should say, of orchestrated campaigns by interest groups and perhaps other opposition groups against female politicians, and quite a bit of lone wolf activity. So what are the implications of all of this? Well, the implications are quite frankly that this is going to have a chilling effect on women entering politics and on sustaining their careers in politics. It's also likely to have an impact on female politicians engaging in political debate online because of online abuse and safety issues. A decade of populism has threatened democracy across the world. It's evidenced, not just in Ireland, but in the UK, the US, and elsewhere. Minorities are targets and are women. Female politicians are a very public target for abuse, and we should all be concerned, because this is concerning. We need greater numbers of female politicians entering politics, not fewer. We must do more to call out this kind of abusive behaviour for what it is. Online abuse of this nature is pernicious, nasty, and cowardly. Misogynist trolls hide behind a veil of anonymity. Armies of keyboard warriors launch missives with venomous intent. Let's be very clear. The threat of physical or sexual violence is a crime. Those responsible should face the full rigors of the law. But the platforms that host this abuse also need to bear responsibility. I do fully appreciate that there is no silver bullet, and it can be quite difficult to do so. But if anyone has ever tried to post a music video or a movie clip to social media and had it removed and received a warning instantly for a breach of their copyright standards, you'll know that social media tech companies can react quickly when they want to. On this issue, they simply haven't. I would add, perhaps cynically, that interaction that engages audiences on social media, no matter how appalling, is for them time spent on the platforms that they can monetize. The angry face emoji, as we know, is now the most popular emoji on Facebook, for example. Social media companies have refused to countenance considering themselves as publishers when it comes to this sort of defamation. But I would argue that it's time for platforms to be held criminally responsible for content that's posted on their sites, on their platforms. Fines running into the millions for failing to act against hate speech and threats of physical and sexual violence are the only way, I believe, that these companies will take their responsibilities seriously. There is room too, of course, for an urgent need for the Oireachtas to legislate here, to enforce existing laws, but also to provide better support for female politicians and to enact new and tougher laws around online and social media abuse and threats against politicians and generally against others. There may well be a role for the EU in making social media companies responsible for content posted on their platforms at an EU level. It's very difficult for individual countries to do it, but perhaps the EU could take a role in that. There's also probably a need for better support for female politicians at local, national and European level. And finally, I think we need to think about a need perhaps for educational and information campaigns around digital literacy, and for society to find a way to have debate online in a constructive way that's respectful to all those involved. If you're interested in more about the study, it was done by myself and my colleagues Emer McCauley and Amy Blaney at NUIG. I'm happy to share the slides afterwards for anyone who's interested in seeing them. But that's me for now. Thanks, Orla.
Thank you, Tom. I think you really have set a really good context for the whole discussion that we're going to have now, both in terms of the extent of online abuse, its implications for women, and I think the real questions of accountability. So thank you. I'm now going to introduce you to Gina Miller. And I should have said, yeah, please put your questions on the Q&A. I can see that there are some already there. So yeah, just keep doing it as people are speaking. So I now want to introduce you to Gina Miller. Gina launched SCN Direct in 2019, and she spearheads the organisation's True and Fair campaign, which called for an end to dubious practices on the investment and pension industry. She has successfully challenged the UK government twice with regard to Brexit. She has campaigned extensively for the government to put forward its online harms bill, and also to extend the duty of care on technology firms to online crowdfunding platforms. Gina herself has experienced serious online abuse, and that's also driving her in her campaign. So you're really welcome. We're delighted that you could be part of the webinar, Gina.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you today. I thought I'd touch on my personal experience and then some solutions, I think, of where we can go next. I'm not a politician, but someone who has been very vocal, a campaigner on the political scene for corporate responsibility, social justice, for the past 30 years. So I'm definitely not a stranger to abuse when you rattle people's cages, challenge the status quo and conflicts of interest. But I have to say the last 5 years have unleashed a level of abuse that is just not against me as a woman, but as a woman of colour is a whole different ballgame. Data shows in the UK that the debate about Brexit, as Tom referenced, was an amplifier and unleashed a toxicity across all forms of dialogue and social interaction. An avalanche of abuse against many women, but especially women of colour like myself. The polarization sucked the oxygen out of tolerance, and in that vacuum, harmony was replaced with hate. And many female politicians, journalists, experts, commentators, we all started experiencing a much heightened level of abuse, victimization of a very special kind. For me, it's a very rare day when I don't get a death threat, when I don't get a threat of rape or disfigurement, that my children are not threatened with being killed, or the fact that they are mixed Jewish and Asian, that they should have been put down at birth for being mongrels. I'm not just a traitor, but a colored traitor, a black bitch who should have her tongue cut out, an immigrant who should learn to watch her word or go back home. I'm not just rich. I'm a rich person who actually might have made her money on her back. This is all online? No. Are messages and abuse just in one medium? No. All these positions and these poisons come from very many different mediums. But the worst source that I can see is definitely social media. It is the poison of a well that is polluting our conversations across all of society, our stream of consciousness, our level of debate. The men, and yes, they are mostly men, who write to me, who send me special gifts, sperm in bags, dolls with pins in it, disgusting cartoons, white powder, all refer to Twitter and Facebook. And they are not from any particular age, socioeconomic background, or educational group, but across society. But what they do have in common is the terrifying truth that they talk to each other on WhatsApp, on Facebook, on closed groups, on social media. The Viscount who called me a boat jumper and offered £5,000 for someone to run over me did that on a closed Facebook group that only came to my attention because someone sent us a screen grab. He was later prosecuted under the Malicious Communications Act, but only got a very short sentence. It was more terrifying to me that these conversations and discussions were happening with 500 people in his group. Then there was the man, Mr. Haslam, who set up a GoFundMe page offering £10,000 with a headline that read, £10,000 to hire a hitman to kill Gina Miller. That page was up for 5 months. GoFundMe could not possibly have had algorithms and due diligence that would not have picked up that headline. What did that man get? He was prosecuted again, got a suspended sentence and £200 fine, less than you would get for most road traffic offences in the UK. But these groups must have accountability. What I am finding is that these threats have moved online. Therefore, we must be policing online. The closed groups really do chill me. Recently, I met one of my worst trolls for a BBC documentary. He said he read headlines in newspapers that called me the most hated woman in Britain. He saw on Twitter and Facebook that I was evil and felt they must be true. But when we chatted, he was not evil. He did not want to see me dead. He got caught up in a conversation online that was pure poison. He wanted to get out, he said, but he didn't know how to. He felt he had to be brave to leave the group and hoped that I would look after myself. This is all the wrong way round. We cannot expect women to have to be safe themselves online. It must be these platforms that have a duty of care and responsibility. Why should we be the ones who have that burden to keep ourselves safe? It is not good enough that women and the vulnerable have to protect themselves. Anonymity cannot be the tool for abusers, and the growing anti-feminist movement online must not be able to develop a manosphere where they can revel in hate towards women with impunity and not be subject to legal liabilities or punishments. Women and girls must be able to feel safe online and offline. We must be able to join conversations, to exercise our civic duty, to exercise our freedom of expression, our freedom of speech, without threats of violence. And what can be done about this? I believe it is now time for governments to act. Few can doubt, as Tom has said, that online platforms of all ilks do good and help people and good causes. But there is a sinister side that needs better policing. Hate crime, which has moved online, must also be funded online. Police and intelligence services must have the resources, because it's not just violence against women, sexual violence, or hate crime. There are funding platforms that are hotbeds for scammers, drug activity, money laundering, trafficking of women and children, funding of extreme organizations. This requires legislation, new regulators, and resource commitments to police and intelligence services to tackle this shift online. In the UK, the government originally promoted the idea of an online regulator back in 2017. An online online harms white paper followed 12 months later, in which the government set out proposals to impose bans and heavy fines on social media companies that failed to protect users and tackle abuse, including making company directors personally responsible for the behavior of users. Why should they be able to profit and become billionaires while so many in society are being victimized? Sadly, in the UK, these proposals have now been pushed back to 2024, which is why I am pushing on the UK government to bring back this legislation next year in 2021. Women, the vulnerable in the UK public, deserve this legislation. We must extend also the duty of care from technology platforms to online crowding platforms, and also talk about the idea of a separate, independent online regulator. We, women of today, and the daughters of tomorrow, deserve to have our freedom of voice without threats of violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Gina. I think you really brought that together for us, and I think you really did show the horrendous extent of the abuse that you have experienced and other women have experienced as well, and the impact that has. Just to say, because there's a number of people who have asked online, research that's been referred to or documents that are being referred to, we are going to make them available as links with the recording, so they will be there, and the same as well with Tom's slides, so that will be available for you. So I now want to introduce you to Maria Walsh. Maria Walsh is an MEP since 2019. She has been an active advocate and campaigner for diversity and inclusion. She was a strong advocate during the marriage equality referendum in Ireland in 2015. She has been very outspoken on LGBTI rights and diversity, and she's currently the vice chair of the LGBTI rights intergroup in the European Parliament. So over to you, Maria.
Thank you, Orla, and wonderful to be here. I'm after hearing from Gina and Tom. Wow, this afternoon is very much needed and very much welcomed. Here are my few words coming as a representative, a female representative in the European Parliament. Imagine a situation where I let someone stand outside my house every day, wearing a placard calling my sexuality an abomination. Imagine I let them spread the lies that hurt me personally, my family, my friends, and my colleagues. That would never happen in real life because I would be proactive. I would call the Gardaí and that person would be removed for being offensive and hateful. Putting someone in fear of their life or well-being is, after all, an assault. and that person would have been removed by the Gardaí because they were offensive and hateful. Since I decided to run in politics, there has been a website set up to attack me over my sexuality and my life choices, calling me an unfit person to be a politician. The allegations made against me stem from a group of people who are homophobic and I truly believe have a problem with a woman holding an elected office. And this is just the tip of the iceberg for what I personally experience and have experienced. As we already heard from Gina, and no doubt we'll hear from Lord Mayor Hazel Chu, this attitude to women in politics is not uncommon, unfortunately. We would hardly recognize ourselves online from the comments that people make about us, about our sexual orientation, about how we dress, how we look, how we act, what we say. Comments that are designed to diminish us, belittle us, and make our viewpoint appear irrational or extreme. And this is not just true for high power or high profile women. A recent survey of 9,000 German internet users aged 10 years to 50 years old found that women were significantly more likely to have experienced online sexual abuse or cyber stalking. Cyber violence against women and girls is something that can recognize and discuss as a common problem. What is harder to accept is that as an MEP, we have not yet legislated against it as a pan-European level. Women and girls are disproportionately targeted for cyber stalking, bullying, and other forms of online harassment. And we all know here today that cyber violence against women is an extension of violence against women in general, and it seems to only be increasing. I want to tell you what myself and colleagues in the European Parliament are trying to do to address this situation. I'm a shadow rapporteur, so working on a file to ratify the Violence and Harassment Convention 2019 from the International Labour Organization. Ratifying this convention would mean that all member states would have to acknowledge that violence disproportionately affects women and girls. This month, we will vote on a file on hate speech and the protection of journalists that I've worked on to highlight that instances of hate speech and online abuse towards journalists, again, disproportionately affects women. What am I working to do is to ensure that references to gender-based violence in all relevant files going forward include both online and offline violence against women. And the more we include those in files relevant, which in my eyes is many, the more legislation and policy-driven campaigns we can do in member states driven from the European Parliament. This is important because I believe that any violence targeting women should be called out for exactly what it is, a transnational, cross-border crime that we cannot allow to be tolerated. Any woman can be assaulted or abused online from any part of the European Union. We need a specific EU instrument that would protect women from these type of violence. I'm delighted to say that the EU Commissioner for Values and Transparency, Commissioner Jourova, and the Commissioner for Equality, Commissioner Dalli, have both indicated and stressed at various points that they will support work in this key area. Online hate speech is a form of criminal victimization that has the potential to reach a large audience, and that audience is growing the more and more online connectors that we have through the increase of technology. It impacts at both an individual and society level. It threatens the human dignity of vulnerable groups, and at the very same time, undermines the social cohesion of our society. I will not, and dare I say cannot, let this issue go because the legislation we currently have in place from the EU institutions on racism and xenophobia does not sufficiently address online hatred, discrimination, or violence. This is an absolute lack of deterrence due to low sanctions and weak legal framework to tackle online hate crimes. And in many ways, who do we point the finger at? Increased technology advancements, of course. Again, society moving a little bit faster than policy and legislation, but enough is enough. I'm delighted that I'll be able to bring the experiences of the many that join us today and the insights, should I be allowed, and share with my colleagues in the European Union, continue to legislate and speak with women and those within the diverse community on what they're experiencing and bring real life circumstance to the floor of the European Parliament. I really look forward to working on more concrete progress, implementing laws and regulations so that we don't see a rise of cyber violence against women. We see it decrease. I'll finish up my few words. I want to thank Orla and the National Women's Council of Ireland for having this event, for ensuring this event is on the conversation table. My fellow speakers, Ali and Vanessa, for allowing all citizens to be a part of this much needed conversation. And finally, thank you to the European Parliament for supporting a much needed event. And I look forward to the rest of the afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. And I can see from the questions coming in on the chat that, much of what you're saying in terms of what needs to be done, I think we'll absolutely return to that in the discussion, because that's very much, I think, where people are going, and people are, certainly energised by what you've said. So I'm now going to introduce Colm O'Gorman. Colm O'Gorman is the Executive Director of Amnesty International Ireland. He's the founder and former director of 1 in 4, which is the national NGO supporting women and men who have experienced sexual violence. And Colm has campaigned extensively at national and a global level for justice and accountability for victims of sexual violence, and has personally initiated very groundbreaking litigation on the issue. He also served as a member of Shanna Darren, and he's a regular media contributor on social justice and human rights issues. Thank you, Colm.
Thanks very much, Orla, and thanks to NWCI and for the European Parliament in Ireland for organising the webinar. It's based on everything we've heard so far, but also on our own research over the years. It's beyond timely. This is an issue that Amnesty International has been gravely concerned about for a number of years. And what I'd like to do is perhaps, first of all, maybe focus in a little bit on the responsibilities in particular of corporates, of social media companies in this regard. So, I mean, companies, wherever they operate in the world, have a responsibility to respect all human rights. That's an internationally endorsed standard of expected conduct for companies. And this corporate responsibility to respect requires social media companies to take concrete steps to avoid causing or contributing to human rights abuses and to address human rights impacts with which they are involved, including by providing effective remedy for any actual impacts. It also requires them, and this is particularly important in the context of today's discussion, to seek to prevent or to mitigate adverse human rights impacts directly linked to their operations or services by their business relationships, even if they have not contributed themselves to those impacts. So in practice, this means that social media companies should be assessing on an ongoing and proactive basis how their policies and practices impact on users' rights to non-discrimination, to freedom of expression and opinion, as well as other rights, and to take steps to mitigate or prevent any possible negative impacts. So that's just to be very, very clear from the get-go about the responsibilities that social media companies have. In our work on this since about 2017, we've largely focused on Twitter in the in-depth research that we've done. And I just want to give you a quick run through what we've identified through that research over the last number of years. So in 2017, we polled 4,000 women in 8 countries and found that over 3/4 of women who had experienced abuse or harassment online made changes to how they use the platform. So 3/4 of those affected, more than 3/4 of those affected, acted to silence themselves as a result of the harassment or abuse that they've experienced online. This included restricting what they post. 32% of women said they'd stop posting any content that expressed their opinion on certain issues. So targeted harassment is directly silencing women. And nearly a quarter of the women we surveyed across those 8 countries said that they'd experienced online abuse or harassment at least once. 41% of women who had experienced online abuse or harassment said that at least on one occasion, these online experiences made them feel that their physical safety was threatened. So the level of threat that's perceived by people as a result of this online harassment is very, very significant. And over half of the women that we spoke to who'd experienced abuse or harassment online said it came from complete strangers. One of the things that I think we're at risk of doing too often is that we accept that this is somehow the new norm, and we ignore the impact that this kind of abuse has. So across all of the countries, 61% of the people that we spoke to said they'd experienced online abuse or harassment, said they experienced lower self-esteem or loss of confidence as a result. Nearly half said they had experienced stress, anxiety, or panic attacks after experiencing online abuse or harassment. And 63% they had not been able to sleep well as a result of the online harassment or abuse. So the impact is very, very significant indeed. And as already been mentioned, there are particular groups of women or subgroups of women who face particular levels of harassment where the abuse is very much intersectional. So we also in 2017, we had 6,500 volunteers from 150 countries take part in an exercise that we call Troll Patrol. This was a crowdsourcing project designed to process large-scale data about online abuse. And volunteers sorted through 228,000 tweets sent to 778 women politicians and journalists in the UK in 2017. And 1 in 10 tweets mentioning Black women politicians and journalists in that sample was abusive or problematic. And the research found that 1.1 million abusive or problematic tweets were sent to the 778 women in the study across the year, or 1 every 30 seconds on average. That's a staggering amount of abuse. We found that Black women were disproportionately targeted, being 84% more likely than white women to be mentioned in abusive or problematic tweets. 1 in 10 tweets mentioning Black women were abusive or problematic, compared to 1 in 15 for white women whose abuse we looked at in the study. Women of color, that's Black, Asian, Latinx, and mixed race women, were 34% more likely to be mentioned in abusive or problematic tweets than white women. And online abuse against women cuts across the political spectrum. So we saw politicians or journalists facing similar levels of online abuse, and we observed whatever place they came from in any political spectrum, that the levels of abuse were fairly consistent right across the score. Now, I think what we've also seen in the last couple of years is a surge of solidarity and activism across the world. And there's no doubt at times we've seen social media companies like Twitter, for instance, play an important role as movements such as Me Too and Black Lives Matter have gained momentum. We've seen them launch initiatives which suggest that they want to be part of meaningful change. But frankly, women and others who've experienced abuse on their platforms simply aren't buying it. And without taking concrete steps to effectively identify and account for violence and abuse against women on their platforms, social media companies cannot credibly claim to be on the side of those who are campaigning for justice broadly in these areas. Tom mentioned earlier on about how quickly social media companies can respond to copyright infringements. Well, let's look at a more recent example of social media companies acting in unison to address what is a very significant problem. Look at the response from social media companies to coronavirus misinformation over the last couple of weeks. You saw a joint industry statement from Facebook, from Twitter, from Google, YouTube, Reddit, Microsoft, and LinkedIn. And yet for almost 4 or 5 years now, we've been consistently flagging very significant levels of very grave online violence and abuse against women on Twitter and on other social media platforms. And it's simply not getting the same level of attention or being treated in the same way. In 2018, we launched a major report on the day that Twitter celebrated 12 years since its first tweet called Toxic Twitter. And that focused on Twitter's failure to deal with violence and abuses against women online. And again, the links to all of this research will be shared later on after the webinar. Just last week, I should flag, by the way, that Twitter's response, and we often see this from social media companies to that research, was that it said it disagreed with their findings and said, quote, "It cannot delete hatred and prejudice from society. nobody is asking social media companies to take responsibility for and singularly address the levels of misogyny, homophobia, racism, and xenophobia that are experienced by women across the world. But what we are insisting they should do, and what they have a clear obligation to do, is to act to ensure that the platforms that they provide, the algorithms that they build, the businesses and corporations that they build in order for them to be able to monetize the activity that happens on those platforms, do at a very minimum respect their obligations to protect women from abuse and harassment, and to ensure that they can go about their work, be they in public or in private life, without fear for themselves, for their safety, and for their families. Thus far, we haven't seen that yet. The kind of advances and suggestions that we've seen that Maria's talked about in the European Parliament context are welcome, and the legislation that Gina's talked about in the UK context are of course are significant. But the multinational nature of these companies really does mean that we need an increased focus on companies to force them to act, to moderate their platforms effectively, and to protect women and other vulnerable sections of society from this level of extreme violence online. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Colm. I can see again from the pieces coming in on the chat, I think people are really agreeing with you in terms of that really strong action that needs to be taken. But also I think the point that you made, which I think really is important, in that there's so much of this abuse online that's becoming normal, and that people are seeing it as normal, and that in itself is a huge problem. It's becoming part and parcel of being engaged in social media. And so I think we might pick up on that later. I'm going to just introduce you now to our final speaker, who's Hazel Chu. I'm delighted that Hazel can join us. Hazel is the Lord Mayor of Dublin. She was elected just in June this year. She was the first Green Party councillor to be elected in the Pembroke ward in Dublin. She's also chair of the Green Party. And Hazel herself has experienced extensive abuse online, both in terms of sexism and racism, and has campaigned, I think, really hard against it. And particularly, I think, is taking that into her Lord Mayorship. So delighted that you could join us, Hazel.
Thank you, Orla, and thank you all to the speakers beforehand. I know Maria and Colm already, so it was great to hear from them, but it was great to hear Gina's stories as well, piece as well, because it resonated a lot. I think anyone here, and it seems like a lot of us here, have experienced firsthand abuse, especially online abuse in recent times. And it seems that as the state of affairs are polarized in the world when it comes to politics and political divisions, that the online abuse is increasing. I'm going to start off, I guess, my short piece about talking a little bit about me first and where I'm coming from. So as Orla says, I'm the Lord Mayor of Dublin. And last year I got elected as councillor of my ward. And after election, before that, I worked in communications. I was head of communications for a multinational, but I'm also a lawyer. So I went into the role naively, perhaps thinking, oh yeah, well, I head communications and crisis communications, so anything that comes my way will be fine. And that was my thought after I got elected, because I thought, well, overall, because I've also achieved quite a high vote, people are obviously very supportive. They were, majority of people, vast majority of people were very supportive. But then you had the loud and vocal minority that started creeping in. And the loud and vocal minority started by online comments first. And it was your kind of once-off kind of comments and short kind of wondering, well, does she really represent us? And then there were more direct comments like, that's slanty-eyed, cunt. And then their comments started kind of moving towards, oh, no, I think we should actually deport her. So, and then this accumulated to a mass pile-on, as I can only call it, over a period of weeks, to then become a man standing on a street with a microphone calling for my deportation. And this is the thing with online abuse. it never stops at just online abuse. I know Gina alluded to it there, and so did Maria. It doesn't stop at just one thing. People write messages online, send messages online, and then it moves to the next step. In my case, it was moving from online to then someone calling me and breathing down the phone very heavily for a few days, to then people calling me and moving from breathing down the phone to actual threats down the phone. And I say this with a smile on my face now, but it was daunting. It was scary. I grew up in a period where there were racism kind of offhand, and my parents, being immigrants, would have suffered it themselves. And but these were always sporadic cases, whereas this was ongoing. It started one day and then it continued. And by the third month of it happening, my other half came home one day and found me crying on the floor, because at the time, it was relentless. It was relentless coming in online. It was relentless coming in via phone calls, and then it came through the door. So again, it beckons back to the point that it doesn't stop. When harassment happens in one platform, it then becomes a natural progression that it moves to another one, and people feel emboldened that they can move to another one, and then eventually you will have a situation where you're face to face with someone that has been trolling you, that has been harassing you, because they think it's okay to then show up at your doorstep and call you all sorts of names and tell you that you are a spy of the CCP and that you should be deported, and that your child should also be aborted like all other Chinese babies. So, and then you find yourself calling the guards or police, sorry, for people who aren't Irish. You find yourself calling the Gardaí, and as the threats mount up, you find that the Gardaí will be coming into your home to from the crime protection unit, trying to make sure that your home is safe. And it becomes a very surreal and frightening situation, because you didn't think that going into a public office would mean that one day there will be a Garda sergeant standing in your kitchen going, well, you need to block up that letterbox because, well, it will mean someone can't put something in that's on fire and burn your house down. And all the while you wonder whether it's worth it. And you wonder, well, did I really go into public office and serve the public to have to deal with this crap? And you seriously start to question people, but you question yourself and your choices. And this is where I was at. I know I speak in the third person, but this is where I was at, because I got to the stage where even after very quickly being in office, I started to wonder, well, my God, should I even be here? Because all these people were telling me not, but also the safety of my family, the safety of my child. And this is the added issue, apart from the safety and the mental health issue of harassment and online harassment particularly, is that it deters people from doing the things that they should be doing. It deters people who should be in there driving policy and fighting to make the world a better place. It deters them from it. And there are very specific reports and stats that shows that people who have suffered online abuse are less likely to go into a public office. And when you have statistics like 82% of female MPs having received psychological harassment online, and that was through an inter-party parliamentary union report, then you understand why people don't take the steps to go and drive policy, to go and form policy. But it's a vicious circle as well, because if you don't have people who have encountered it willing to go into it, or who have an interest to try to protect and build these policies and safeguards people's rights, then you will never have the right people at the table either. You will never have people who hold those interests at. And that's why it's up to us. It's up to the group here, people listening online. It's really important to, as Colm say, hold the companies to account, but hold individuals to account. In Ireland, we're looking at hate crime legislation, but to Gina's point, that hate crime legislation needs to be applicable online. To Colm's point, in terms of corporate companies, I've spoken to Twitter, I've spoken to Google about this, and Facebook. the issue is holding them to account, but also they're for-profit companies. What they would look to do is make a profit. So I don't want to just hold them to account. I want them to work with us because they will not be going away anytime soon. So I think holding them to account and slapping them with a fine is one thing, but ensuring that they provide proper reporting, not just even just in terms of removing a user, but provide proper stats, proper reporting to work with the various advocacy groups and think tanks and NGOs is the vital part, because a lot of people will ask the question, well, they're not going to try to kill their own business. But the fact remains, if our online platforms grow more and more toxic, their user base will leave. And as such, they are protecting their own interests. So there is an element of a stick that we need to have in terms of legislation, but there needs to be a carrot as well in terms of how do we work with online companies to drive them to a more proactive protocol when it comes to online harassment. And I think that first of all comes in terms of reporting and data and stats, because the reports currently that I'm able to find are the ones that Colm cited in terms of Amnesty, in terms of the Interparliamentary Union reports. But there is a definite issue when it comes to overall reporting and also evidence, because unless we have the evidence there, unless we can build the evidence, and this is perhaps the lawyer in me thinking it, you can never form a case where we're directly building a process and the right legislation for it as well. So I think having the right working relationships with the corporates, but also building a right state of evidence, and research database is the most important thing. But the third thing is also, I think there needs to, from all of us, a certain amount of empathy. The amount of times that I definitely, when I mentioned online harassment, the first thing people say to me is, oh, what did you do? Or what did you do to do that? Or, oh, are you sure? It's that very much victim blaming attitude we seem to do across all sorts of harassment. But when it comes to online, I think people are quicker to jump to the gun that they don't tend to want to believe you. And that in itself is a massive issue. It's why you have Me Too and I Believe You campaigns, and why they work really well in terms of people then being able to come forward. I myself sometimes don't even believe things are happening. And a recent case, an example.
Can I ask you to finish up if that's okay?
Oh, sorry, Orla, sorry.
No, that's okay, because I just want to have lots of time for discussion, and I will be coming back to you so you can add in more.
Yeah, I'm gonna end with this little anecdote.
Sure.
I had a journalist call me recently to say, hey, Hazel, I want to get a quote from you. And I said, okay, what's it about? And she goes, well, we did some data, we did some research from March to now, and yourself and another person are the most trolled politicians in this period. What's your reaction? And my reaction was, oh, it's surprising, but it's like someone told you that you won a prize, but the prize is shit sandwich, as I called it at the time. I actually gave her that direct quote, and she just laughed, because that's the state of affairs we're in. We're becoming to the point that online harassment is so bad that people end up not believing it themselves when they're encountering it, and that's something we have to change too. Sorry, Orla, I know I went on a bit long there.
No, you're absolutely fine. And also, like, I think you've really, I think, described so well the impact this has on women going forward into politics, which is, I suppose, is where we started, because we know that in the Women's Council from all our work around women in politics, this is an enormous issue that really makes women very reluctant, and totally understandably why, in terms of it not being dealt with. So just in terms of bringing everybody back in now for the discussion, I know some people have asked me to repeat the hashtag, it's Stop Online Abuse. There's a lot of discussion about the webinar on social media at the moment, and people are really appreciative of people sharing their experiences. So they wanted that fed back to the speakers. So just looking at the different questions that have come in, you know, I'm trying to group them really under sort of themes to give people a chance to get back in. So certainly I think one of them is they're very much about the what can we do. So there's a lot of people talking about their experiences and how bad it is, and it is about what can we do. And in terms of the what can we do, one of the issues that's coming up is that it's very much about the victim, or you know, the person who's receiving the abuse, having to come forward, having to constantly report, having to constantly chase the social media organizations, and we need to flip it. So maybe if I can have maybe some comments on that, and I might go to you, Gina, first on that. Is Gina there, or am I?
If you could just repeat the question to me, Orla, sorry.
So it was about the comments that are coming in saying that at the moment, the onus is very much on the person who's getting all the abuse to chase the social media platforms, to get accounts closed down, to, you know, it's up to them to do all the reporting, to do all that. And what the questions are sort of being asked about is how can we change that around, that it shouldn't be all about the victim or the person receiving the abuse having to do it. It should be about the platforms taking responsibility.
Yes, I mean, I think the absurdity of it, I tend to say, it's like you're selling a car and you say the person who gets in the car to drive has to make sure that it is safe to drive, that you've actually got to do all the safety checks. I mean, that's completely ridiculous. Of course not. It's got to be fit for purpose. So if a platform is out there and is inviting people to use it in all its formats, then it has to be fit for purpose. And part of that purpose has to create a safe environment and the duty of care. So I do think it's up to platforms. And, you know, Colm said it with what happened with COVID and the way the platforms came together. My experience is that I don't believe there's very much being done. I mean, the algorithms should pick things up. They're not being picking things up. On Facebook, when these closed groups, you don't know what's happening. You know, I've got another example. I have a special needs daughter who's 32 who is being groomed online at Facebook. Because she's mental age of 5 or 6, over 18, but had forgotten her password, they wouldn't let me take the page down. They wouldn't let me give me any access. And I had to go all the way to Facebook Europe to threaten them to expose them in media. This was a few years ago, until they took it down. And they said to me that they couldn't tell what was going on in closed groups. I'm sorry, but they do know what's going on in closed groups. So I think it's got to be more of, there's got to be a legislative burden and a financial burden, I think. And thirdly, I'd say a personal duty of care and responsibility to the owners of these platforms. As Colm said, Tom said, Marie, we're all saying these platforms are earning billions, absolute billions with impunity. And it just can't carry on like this. There has to be duties on them. It can't be up to the users. Why should we as women have to keep ourselves safe? Why do we have to get in the car and check that it works? You know, it is completely the wrong way around.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Colm, do you want to come in on this as well?
Yeah, I will. Thanks, Orla. I mean, one of the things that really gets my goat a little bit is that, you know, we go through cycles in society of seeing moments when really appalling abuse or violations are revealed. And then as a society, we stand back and we laud the victims who've come forward as being incredibly courageous. And of course, that is true. It takes a huge amount of courage for people to come out and speak publicly and to name the kind of abuse that they've experienced. But actually, I think we start to need to reflect on how the very fact that it requires that level of courage is really an indication of how we're failing as societies to properly identify and respond to abuse that's very much happening in plain sight. I mean, nobody is unaware of the level of abuse that people are experiencing online at the moment. Governments are not unaware. Those of us who use the platforms are not unaware. We're all aware of it. And if we act, if we demand change, it will happen. It's as simple as that. It always has been. Change, when it happens at this kind of level, happens because sufficient numbers of people demand it. And the social media companies will react to that if people get on board and get behind demands for change. And again, let's not forget the impacts here that we're talking about here. I mean, as Laura Bates, who was the founder of the Everyday Sexism Project, said to us when we were talking about her own experience and about the impact, she said, the psychological impact of reading through someone's really graphic thoughts about raping and murdering you is not necessarily acknowledged. You could be sitting at home in your living room outside of working hours, and suddenly someone is able to send you an incredibly graphic rape threat right into the palm of your hand. So that's the kind of abuse, of threat, of violence that this failure to get to grips with this problem is causing women to endure. And we all have to be concerned about that. And then if we think about the significance and importance of women in politics, I mean, I hope we don't need to get into that conversation here right now. It's in all of our interests to ensure that women play a very active, powerful role in politics. We're all cheapened, we're all lessened, our societies are poorly served if that's not the case. And this is a very significant barrier to that at the moment, so we have to address it.
Yeah, absolutely. And then maybe to turn to the legislation, because there's a lot of questions in about what type of legislation in Ireland would yourselves see working, and within that, what do you think the sanctions should be? So maybe I'll go to Hazel. Hazel, would you like to say something about the type of legislation you'd like to see? Can't hear you, Hazel, you're on mute.
I got muted there. Sorry. I think we all touched on this in terms of the hate crime legislation that we talk about, but there's an added layer. There's an added layer on the online, because you can have hate crime legislation, but if it's not applicable online, it doesn't mean anything at all. So, and to Gina's point about regulators, we need to have that in place, and we need to have that in Ireland, which is something that has been spoken about, but again, hasn't been planned yet. And it actually stems from the child protection space as well. So it crosses over various spaces. So you talk about kind of women and harassment, but then on the online space, there's child protection issues as well. Like, that is why a regulator is essential when we're looking at the overall online space and how we then build legislation for it. But the hate crime legislation that's coming in hopefully in the next year, I know we're on second consultation process, that I would like to make sure our policymakers are tying in to make sure that it's an online online method as well. So
just on the hate crime legislation, because I see there's a question in there about that there is a conversation as to whether misogyny should be part of our hate crime legislation, and that was, you know, that was not in the first drafting of the bill. Do you want to just say something on that to finish off that piece, Hazel?
It's a hard one. It is a hard one to gauge, because I think as it stands, it is a form of harassment. Misogyny is a form of harassment. So I do think we need to look at that, but we need to be careful that we are not pitting one gender across from another, because the hate crime itself is overall as a whole fit for all. So but I do think we need to look at that aspect, and I think you're right. I think the person providing that point has a valid one. So
yeah, and it is something the National Women's Council is advocating. We believe it should be part of our hate crime legislation. Maybe Maria, do you want to say something about that legislative piece? And also, I know one of the questions is, you know, are there examples of, you know, particularly stronger sanctions maybe in other countries? People are asking as well across the EU.
And great questions. I mean, I often when I was personally experiencing you know, a couple of years ago, being a part of a little festival called the Rose of Tralee, and then fast forward into the political space, you know, it was remarkable to me how distasteful messaging around my orientation and what I looked like then only amplified when I got into politics, and amplified to a level I don't think me and my family had ever even, I personally never thought we could get there. And I often thought when I was reading comments, you know, I think of Brene Brown, who is a stellar advocate for rights, not just for women's rights, who openly talks about how she deals with negative and online hate speech, and how it affects her. And for me, she is the perfect person when you talk about being a balanced and looking at different levels of how to progress. And then I think of Julia Roberts and her famous quote of "Women are not rehabilitation centers for badly raised men." Now, picking up on what Hazel said, it's an inclusive. Online abuse is not just for women and not men, but predominantly, as I said in my few words, it's disproportionately focused on women and young girls. I often then think of being in a function room a number of years back and hearing from a department within the Garda Síochána asking for teachers and parents to be aware that child pornography and online abuse and the fast pace of technology is having on the misuse of messages and pictures online, and how we can best protect our younger people. And within that, and your question around legislation, from a European side, we have a lot of work to do on solidarity. And the term is not just a buzzword, it needs to be an act. I believe, and I agree with Gina and all speakers in terms of the financial and legislation sanctions. Sometimes I think when I see quotes and mean comments, I think it should be like Switzerland for speeding tickets, that a percentage that you feel in your pocket is being brought on to either tech companies or the person themselves, because when you're physically, or when you're financially feeling it, I should say, then you would hope that people stop in the tracks. But I also, I don't want to go as far as saying I was disappointed, but I certainly pushed for the conversation around a minister appointment within the specific digital safety and ethical space. And I'd be calling on that for a designated department that looks solely on protecting people and the fast pace of technology. From my side, in the European front, like I said in my opening few words, anything that has to do with women and children and ethical standards, I include amendments. There's a number of colleagues right across the House that believe the same as I do, and same as many here today. But we do have some who in countries, predominantly in the eastern side of the European Union, that don't look at misogyny or don't look at online or hate abuse, or until it's unfortunately in the physical standard, and to which then in many cases women and children are most at risk. But like I said, we have an awful lot of work to do, and it's not just about one institution here in the European Parliament, it's the Commission, and then effectively the Council needs to push through. I mean, I have highlighted there, I'm working on I got assigned as a rapporteur on a file that has been blocked since 2008, looking at protecting women and children within this space, blocked by members of the Council. So when you have that, and I go back to the term solidarity that we like to throw around, then for our case, we have a lot of work to do. But I hope anybody who has suggestions, your participants today, please get in contact if you see ways that we can help in the European front, because that's what I'm here to do.
Okay, thanks, Maria. Tom, maybe to you, just even on that legislation one, just from the research that you've been looking at internationally, if there's something you'd like to add there.
Well, I mean, I think it's clear that we do need an online safety commissioner. I think it's very clear, not just to police this area, but to police the whole gamut of child safety and child protection and so on. But just specifically on the legislation, I think there's a national level legislation and there's European level legislation. I think at a national level, there are existing laws that simply aren't being enforced. You know, hate speech is a crime, and yet there's very little of it actually is being investigated. Gina made the points from the UK. Now, the guards probably don't have the resources to do that, but these are crimes that need to be investigated and properly tackled. We probably need much more stronger cybercrime legislation than around online safety, digital safety, and digital protection. That really tackles these kinds of issues online. They don't exist at a European level. I think this has to come from Europe, because these companies are multinational. We need to see multi-million euro fines hurt these companies in their pockets if they won't tackle these issues. Significant fines imposed on these companies. The EU really is the only organization in the world who do this. The Americans won't do it. It's very hard for a country like Ireland to take on Apple or Facebook or Twitter. But at an EU level, I think there's the muscle there to do that. So I think we need a number of policy responses. But I'd also go back just to the point that I think we simply need education and digital literacy classes in schools. It is a lot of the time young men who engage in this kind of behavior. So we do need to see, I think this brought into the curriculum at secondary school, and maybe even indeed at university level, where this kind of behaviour is called out. There's discussion about it, and it's dealt with in that way as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Gina, you wanted to come back in there. You're on mute, Gina.
So yes, we're talking about legislation, and yes, there is legislation. In the UK, we've got Malicious Communications Act, we've got threats against sexual and racial violence, but somehow the medium of online, people think of it differently, and I think that's a mindset we've got to change. It's the fact that that somehow it does lesser harm if it's online, that it's not real crime. That it's somehow watered down, and that's a social mind shift we've got to create with all of us, because the responsibility can't just be down to the law. So I think it's got to be that we talk. You talk about education. One of the areas that we talk about when we talk about technology, you look at the young men and the games they're playing, and some of the misogyny that's in those games, and some of the violence. There's a cross pollution happening here. So you have to look at everything. And I think we need to take a prismatic view where we look at all of the elements of what that we need to address, because it's been going on for far too long now. And the cumulative effect on society and on the next generation is too high a price for us to look away any longer. And I think that's why we've got to look at this from all points of views. And I'd say that if the legislation is going to take time, then we as consumers should also be using our power, our purchasing power, when it comes to things like, if there are companies who are saying their majority of their customers are female, well, why are you advertising on platforms that are doing harm against women? If you're saying you're talking, we all have to be part of this conversation. The politicians, the male politicians, have to speak out for their female colleagues, the same in companies for leadership. We can't say it's somebody else's problem any longer. We all have to take responsibility. And that's where I think just running to the law is going to take too long. And I think this idea that it's somebody else's responsibility is going to have to stop.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I'm going to, because there's 10 minutes left and I want to get everyone in, but maybe because there's a question in, and which I think is a sort of a good one maybe for you to give your final reflections on, and that is, so, what is the best way now to build a collective momentum on this issue? And it'd be useful maybe, I think, from your different perspectives, whether, as politicians or as, civil society campaigners or academics, to give a perspective on that. There's certainly a strong feeling because we're now trending on social media in terms of, okay, what can we do? So I'm going to start with you, Tom.
I'll mute myself there. Look, we can respond very positively to things when we want to as a country. I think, Gina's absolutely right. It isn't good enough just to say that we need legislation. Civility has been lost on social media. I think, perhaps it's time to start, all of us, calling out this kind of behavior when we see it ourselves, not just ignoring it. I mean, one of the things, for example, I often see people do is they retweet or they comment, saying this is inappropriate, but actually maybe what we should be doing is starving the trolls of the oxygen of publicity. The other thing I think is Gina makes a really good point, is actually, if there are companies that are advertising on social media, do ask them to reconsider if you see ads that are appearing in certain places. So I think it is important that we all have a role to play here, that we do call it out. Legislation is important, but it's not going to happen quickly enough. And if we want change, we do need to make that change happen ourselves. Yeah,
thanks, Tom. Maria?
Yeah, I mean, picking up from what Tom and Gina had just shared, we are the consumers, and at some point we lost I speak on a personal level just as much as a political level. Like, we have lost the fact that we are the drivers of this change, and that goes down to limiting our use on social media, as Tom shared, calling it out, I used to not go into the space of blocking or flagging if it got, because I was told when I did complain over my campaign to the Facebook and Twitters of the world that it's free speech, but there's a fine line, and often people are on the far side of it. So calling people out, but ensuring that they are reported just as much as you are either blocking them or ignoring them. And then from a legislation and political side, certainly seeing and raising awareness to political leaders, regardless of where you sit on the political spectrum. And me and Hazel don't share the same political party, but we certainly share the same views in terms of protecting our citizens. And for me, not just across Ireland, nor Hazel, if you don't mind me saying, Hazel, but across the European Union and world. That's our job. Our responsibility is put our hand up and get involved and protect people who are consuming absolute nonsensical and irrational thoughts of people who like to live behind a keyboard. And then in turn, we need to work a lot harder with our leaders and trying to not just have society yet again be years ahead of the policy and legislation. We need to get closer on that one. Thanks,
Maria. Hazel.
It's food for thought there. I guess one of the things I definitely would say is the calling it out is important, because just to Maria's point of, if someone stood in your garden holding a plaque of insults, you're not going to let them, you're not going to just let them leave and walk away. It's the same when it comes to online. A lot of people ask me, oh, why do you bother? Why do you waste your time? If you have the audacity to come at me and threaten me, then I am going to make sure that it gets reported and it gets seen to. Now, our issue right now, as we all acknowledge, is that there is the gap of after reporting what will happen. And that's us up to policymakers to make sure that gap is filled. But I do say to people, if you see something, call it out, and it is important. It's important not to hide and go, it will go away, because I think we've come to this point of the fight now that it doesn't go away. And what will happen is a lot of the harassment then turns into disinformation as well. It turns into a certain narrative that drives people to a different place, and you will have a more and more hostile online situation where it's not just people harassing people, it's people feeding out lies, and it kind of accumulates. So for me, it's very important to call out, but also it's very important to, I think, have those conversations with corporates. I think a lot of us are just reporting, or we're writing to our TDs or our legislators, but I would very much start emailing and writing and to Colm's campaign, Colm's thoughts on the campaign, write to your platforms and say, listen, if you don't stop this, I'm going to go to this other platform. That's the thing. We are the consumers, as noted here. So we need to take that power and go, right, we're not going to use you. And you can see it with Facebook. There was a period there where people did start shopping on Facebook, and they started changing things a bit, but it didn't get in, it wasn't enough. So you need the monetary fines, but you need actual people power to start going, well, no, we're not going to actually continue on this platform if you can't put in the right measures.
Thanks, Hazel. Colm?
Yeah, a few thoughts. I suppose, first of all, we need to continue to talk about the impact, right? About the reality of what's happening, and we have to not ignore it. And I think there's a real need, and I try to do this in my own interactions online as well, as not getting too much pulled into a to and fro with the abuser, right? Because that's what they want. They want to create drama. They want to create heat. They want to divert you away from doing the work that you're doing by engaging you in this endless to and fro. Sometimes I think it's really important to lift it up and elevate it as an example. But we have to focus on impact. And, one of the things that I, in what everybody has acknowledged here today about their own experiences, we haven't also talked about the impact that this kind of abuse that targets individual online has on other people in that person's life, the people who love them. I mean, you go home and your family are there terrified for you, horrified for you, appalled by you. By what's happening to you and what's being said to you or about you, or how they're pulled into it, as Gina outlined in her own case. This is not in any way a minor issue. This does not have minor impact. This has devastating impact on the people who are targets and on the mental health and well-being of the people who love them on their families too. And we need to talk about that a lot more, because certainly that's something that I've just had a dog burst in the door. Happy working from home moment. We see, we're seeing more and more of that now. Consumer campaigns are picking up. They're really, really important. They will help. We saw that with Facebook targeting advertisers over the last couple of years, and we'll see more of that. But we do need to keep a focus on companies, and we absolutely need to hold companies to account for applying the policies that they say they are applying. I mean, I had something happen recently where I got a notification from Twitter about a report that I'd made. I have no memory of making a report to Twitter about an abusive tweet in many months, because quite frankly, I've given up on doing it a lot of the time. And yet many, many months later, I get an email from Twitter about a report. They're not doing the minimum things that they've said they will do, and the minimum things that they're saying they're going to do are not enough. The focus must be on the companies. And yes, we have to look to legislate to force good conduct on their part as well. But we also need to apply every possible other pressure that we can as consumers and as users of the platforms. And then finally, very quickly, the best way to defeat hate is with love. Tom talked about, how there's a lack of civility online. Let's manifest the opposite, right? Let's not just starve them of oxygen. Let's overwhelm them with the opposite of what it is they're trying to manifest. Let's be champions of civility and decency and humanity and of fierce love online. And I know that can sound terribly trite, but it has massive, massive impact. I've seen lots of examples of that recently, where we've seen people being targeted by online hate, and people have stepped in and not elevated the hate, rather they've elevated their love and respect and concern for the individual who's being targeted, by talking about them and their work and their integrity and the value of their work without making any reference to the hate. We need to see an awful lot more of that too.
Yeah, absolutely. And final word to you, Gina.
I have to say, Colm has nearly brought me to tears by acknowledging the effect on family, because, cybercrime has real victims. And it's not, for my young children to have to be walked through, because I'm not a politician, but to have, how do you use a panic button, special line to a terrorism squad, to have children have to grow up and see that if they use their voice and they have a woman who is as strong as their mother is very debilitating for them and their upbringing. So thank you, Colm, for acknowledging that. But I think we have to also understand that this is about money, follow the money. It really is about that. We've got to, it's been too long. It's been years now where companies have said that they will take on that duty of care, that they will abide by, such corporate codes, conduct codes. It's not been good enough. And I think it's almost time now for a short, sharp shock before we move to the next level. And I think that is money. That's where they're going to feel it. They're going to feel it in their pocket. And so I think we have to start doing that, not just as legislators, but as actually consumers. I think we've got to start to act as consumers. We have to be responsible for each other. And finally, I'd say, again, to Colm, is that when I talked about meeting my troll, one of the worst people who trolled me, and we realized that we felt the same about our sons. We felt the same fear about the future. We talked and understood each other. We're now friends. I talked to him, and he's one of the best advocates for me now. He's absolutely brilliant, Alan. I mean, he's just nonstop. And, what I did is I reached out to him, and we acknowledged each other's humanity and our hurt. And I think if we can do that more often, we will move to a better place. But also, I think it's also resisting the temptation to respond in the same tone. I always try to be extremely polite and understanding and engaging on a different level. And I have found that what comes back to me is that quite often they'll engage at a different level as well. So when I lift up, they lift up too. I know there's a temptation, and anger and upset and all those negative emotions can wash over you. But if you resist them and you go towards the positive emotions, you inspire others to do so too.
Yeah, well said. Okay, yeah, absolutely. I mean, just to thank you all, because I think that was such a really rich discussion. I think you've really shown what a critical this issue it is for women. And I think rightly, you know, we've just said in terms of the impact for women, but also everyone, you know, who is around that person who's receiving the abuse. And as I said earlier, also for women in politics is often the people who are working in those offices and moderating them. So it has such an enormous ripple effect. And I think, you know, we've said this is critical for women. We've also said what a chilling effect this has for women's participation in politics, but in all aspects of society. So, you know, I certainly hope, and I know we do in the Women's Council, hope that this is the start of really elevating this issue now to a much more serious level in Ireland and looking at what we can do to tackle it. And I just want to thank again the European Parliament, all of you, Gina, Hazel, Colm, Tom and Maria. And also just to say for those of you listening in, I know Gina and Hazel will be on Drive Time on RTE Radio at 6, so you can hear more of what they have to say. So thank you everyone for participating. Really appreciated all your questions. I probably didn't get to them all, but yeah, thank you so much. So goodbye from us all.